For years, I've put off watching In Cold Blood because I wanted to read the book first. But given that I don't know how to read, I've finally decided to watch the movie. Turns out, it's great. This movie is a lot of different things. It's a piece of history, but it's also timeless. Sometimes when you watch a legendary film that had a big impact, you'll find that you've already seen most of it in other newer movies, and the original can look a little pale compared to everything that comes after it. That is not the case with In Cold Blood. This is a movie that really stands on its own, and a big part of that is style. Some people might be tempted to call this a noir film because it's black and white and has a lot of contrast and a lot of angles, but to me this falls into a slightly different category. I don't really know if there's a term for this, but I guess I call it a jazzy post-noir. You can file it with The Sweet Smell of Success, Compulsion, things like that. Quincy Jones did the score for this film, and it swings. Actually, the whole movie swings. It's quick. It's got a bunch of cool match cuts, like when we go from a speeding car to a speeding train. It's got a bunch of clever sound bridges. There's a nice moment, too, where someone turns off a lamp and the sound cuts off as the light goes out. Not a super common technique. Music is used really well in this film, and so is silence. This is a movie that really moves along, and it really looks cool. Like I said, we have some expressionistic visuals. This film is kind of the definition of crisp black and white. Now, In Cold Blood was made in 1967, so it could have been made in color, but it's hard to imagine what that would have been like. This is a movie that really lives in the shadows, really owns its style, and it doesn't feel like it's something that's been duplicated exactly. Now, I hesitate to call this a noir film for a few different reasons. For one, we have a bunch of other interesting stylistic choices, like some great ensemble staging. That's not incompatible with noir, but I don't really associate them very much. Actually, the movie that comes to mind is the Kurosawa film High and Low, which is one of my favorite procedurals. Strongly recommend that. There's a couple scenes where the cops are listening to a tape recorder that look like they could have been pulled straight out of Kurosawa's film. More significant probably is all the documentary stuff. In Cold Blood was largely filmed on location, as in they went back to the farmhouse where the murders actually occurred. They couldn't film inside the prison, but they were able to buy the toilets from the original cells and build them into the sets of the film. Now, who knows if the origin of the toilets comes across on screen, but this is certainly a far cry from the studio lots that define a lot of classic Hollywood. This is not a classic Hollywood film. To me, though, one of the most interesting things about the movie is seeing how it lives kind of on the fringes of classic Hollywood, how it teeters back and forth. Clearly, it has some noir influences, and sometimes it leans into something a bit traditional, I guess. This movie has no stars in it, which is more in this neorealist style. And, that never would have flown in classic Hollywood. Even though there's no big stars in the movie, though, Hollywood kind of seems to make an appearance. The main characters, they kind of look like movie stars. Scott Wilson, who plays Dick, looks a fair amount like Paul Newman. Robert Blake reminds me a little bit of Paul Anka or Sal Mineo. The point is not that these guys are impersonating anyone. They don't really look that much like other actors, but there is a touch of Hollywood to them, and there are moments where they really lean into some classic ideas a little bit, like when Perry starts talking about looking for gold or going to Mexico. This feels like a little piece of the treasure of the Sierra Madre or High Sierra, or maybe even the Grapes of Wrath. Now, I'm not sure if the movie here is trying to show us how average people come to inhabit Hollywood personas, or if the film itself just slips into a few tropes. Either way, it's interesting to see how classic Hollywood and classic America show up in this very modern story. At one point, we even get a discussion of double indemnity in an insurance policy, that is. But is this a nod to a certain noir heritage? Perhaps. Who knows? Might be a bit far-fetched. The point is that the movie sometimes leans into the classic stuff. On the other hand, it does things that would have been blasphemous had it come out 15 years earlier. One thing, maybe a little more on the subtle side, not quite the blasphemy side, is that the film avoids some of the sort of hallmark dramatic logic of earlier generations. It's hard to predict exactly what the shape of the film is going to be. Where will it take us? Where will it end? How long will it be? Like, what's the final scene of this movie going to be? You're not really going to know that when you start out watching it, or even when you're almost to the end. Partly this is because it jumps around so much. It jumps between different plot lines, it jumps backwards and forward in time. But it also does some more subtle stuff to sidestep some of the clockwork drama that is so central to a lot of like noir stuff or mystery films. For example, Perry and Dick hear about the farm that they try to rob from Dick's cellmate in prison. Once the crime has been committed, the cops are begging for tips. They're on the radio across the country begging for people to come forward, offering a reward. And we get this shot of a guy in a cell, and they don't even have to tell you who it is. You know that that must have been Dick's cellmate. And you realize that he could rat them out. There's a little bit of a hole in the story. This feels like a twist you'd see in a noir film, but the next shot, the next scene is kind of interesting. Rather than showing us the prisoner calling in his tip, we hear somebody else calling in a tip. And it's a tip that's unsubstantiated, not useful at all. And then we hear the cops complaining about all the bogus information they have to sift through from people just hoping to collect the reward and make some quick money. Now, I guess this might add a little bit of suspense in some ways, just delaying the inevitable or something. But I think the main result is a little bit different. It kind of sidesteps the procedural logic that you would find in most crime films. This isn't the kind of film where one clue leads to another clue, leads to another clue. It's more of an exploration where we visit all the different pieces of the story as things slowly wind towards the end. We see, oh yeah, right, this is what it would be like to be on the tip line. You got to deal with a bunch of jokers. We see, oh right, this is what it would be like to do this. Oh, this is what an interrogation would be like. Very interesting piece of it. Feels much more like an expose than a carefully choreographed game of cat and mouse or something like this. Anyway, this wouldn't have been so common in classic Hollywood, I think. Probably the most obvious departure from previous generations is that In Cold Blood would have been totally at odds with the production code. It is surprisingly graphic, and it is haunting. It's also morally ambiguous in some ways. The story of film in the 50s, 60s, and 70s can kind of be thought about, I guess, in a little bit as the story of the production code and the abandonment of the production code. Films like Anatomy of a Murder, Bonnie and Clyde, The Godfather, these are the really famous waypoints on the journey out of this contrived classic world where husband and wife had to, or where lovers had to sleep in separate beds, couldn't kiss for more than 4 seconds, where you couldn't have a character commit suicide to get out of a problem, where the bad guys always had to lose in the end, had to be confronted and find justice, all these things. A journey out of that into something else. In Cold Blood feels like another important waypoint along this journey. This film has a moral detachment that was really not common at the time, but that has come to underpin basically all of true crime, I think. Maybe at some point it would have seemed like horrifying stories could only be told against a moral backdrop, either because that was the right thing to do, right? We have to provide the moral backdrop, or because people thought that the moral structure would actually heighten the significance of the transgression. Right? Without the system, without seeing what you're supposed to do, how do you know that it's horrifying? How do you know this other stuff is bad? In true crime, things generally work differently. We get a haunting story and we get moral detachment. And it turns out that those things can actually build on each other. If anything, a bit of moral instability, a few lingering questions about justice can add fuel to the fire of human suffering and transgression. I'm not going to say that this film invented anything, but it's an early example of a lasting method, and one that's completely at odds with a more classic movie. The film, and of course the book, which really pioneered these things, also has an interesting mix of action, suspense, horror, but also political and philosophical questions about the structure of society and about the nature of crime. The film's comment on the death penalty is the clearest example, I guess, but the movie also has some Freudian moments where police speculate on the causes of crime in the individual, and where the film more or less illustrates Perry's sexual frustration or the poor conditions of his childhood. Kind of interesting to see that psychoanalytic mindset, which would have really been in the common sort of zeitgeist at the time. Meanwhile, other people in the movie wonder, what has happened to society? It seems like the world is getting more depraved, more violent, or maybe it's a recency or frequency illusion. Who knows? I guess it still feels like that to some extent. Would it have been better to go back to the 50s, to repression and the production code? Who knows? So it's a chilling story of crime, but it also lingers on a number of questions. And this, again, seems to have become the formula for just about every true crime podcast that you can find these days. Yes, there's a crime, but there's also some deeper questions that are hinted at, probably not exactly answered, and where the gravity of the crime really ramps up the question, I guess. In some regional crime films, the location is a huge, huge part of the film. If you think about In the Heat of the Night or Mississippi Burning, things like that, the location almost eclipses everything else in the film. I like both of those movies, and I think it makes a lot of sense in that context. But here we have another Southern movie, and it's got a few incisive Southern observations, like when the lawyer reads to a jury from the Bible. But for the most part, this film doesn't feel as fixated on location as some other films. Now, In the Heat of the Night and Mississippi Burning are both films about racism. There doesn't really seem to be much race in this film, except maybe Quincy Jones' score. But if you look a bit closer, this is sort of an outsider story. For one thing, Perry is apparently half Cherokee, at least according to his father. His father is some kind of circus performer who lives in a shack. Some kind of outsider. There's also something profound about the disillusionment in this film. In some ways, we see characters living the antithesis of the American dream. I think there's a lingering insight in this. In Cold Blood is in some ways a story of decay. And really, most newer true crime films, books, podcasts follow a similar pattern, giving us a crime that is somehow linked to a social problem and the breakdown of some sort of good life. And this is, another reason why it's interesting that this movie teeters on the classic. Why it's interesting that Dick looks like Paul Newman and he can impersonate someone with class so easily, because of how potent this American vocabulary is, I guess. But as alluring as it is, that's also cruel in some ways, I guess. So, yeah, a bit of a formula that has stood the test of time. That's In Cold Blood. It's a great movie, just to watch. I recommend you check it out. And I don't know, to be honest, one of the reasons I put this off was that I don't really know anything about Truman Capote, and there's a lot to know about him. Very interesting guy, it seems like. So this review just focused on the film itself. Hopefully it was offered some vague insight. I haven't decided yet. I might watch the film Capote in the future. We'll see if I have the time. I'm very busy, but we'll see if I have the time to actually do some biographical research. But yeah, as it stands, In Cold Blood, really a strong movie that's worth checking out if it has somehow slipped through your radar like it did for me.